When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hey friends, I'm Rachael and I'm your host for the Hearing Jesus podcast, where I help you to know God and to make Him known. Today we are continuing Mark chapter 5, and we're going through the end of the chapter today. And if you're just joining us, we are going through the Gospel of Mark, and we're looking at the teaching and the actions of the Apostle Peter written by Mark. And we have gone through a lot of this content before. If you were with us last year at this time, we did the Gospel of Matthew. And because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all synoptic gospels, that basically means that it's different perspectives on the same content, the same experiences. And so I'm trying not to duplicate that. If you want more from this episode, specifically about some of the history or the context or the culture, I cover a lot of that when we covered this in the Matthew series. So feel free to go back and listen to that as a companion if you want to dive a little bit deeper. And then also, just as a reminder, we have lots of extra resources to help you continue as you are using these resources to help you grow in your spiritual life. We have a kids episode that goes along with this content. We have family discussion guides. We have journaling prompts. All of that is linked at the link in our bio, in our show notes. And so I'm in Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around and in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you can ask, who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.' While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother the teacher anymore?' Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, 'Don't be afraid, just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha cum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately, the little girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Now, if you're following along on the kids episode, you'll know that I actually separated this into two different episodes, these two stories, because when we're talking about this content with kids, it just is a little bit easier to explain that way. But for the adult episode, I decided to leave them together because I think often what happens is they are taught separately, but really the way that Mark designed this content is to be told together. And there's a reason for that. I did really dive into that when we covered this in the book of Matthew from a cultural, historical perspective, but here I want to talk about the spiritual implications. So think about what we talked about in yesterday's episode, where there's this contrast of how Jesus was in the Gerasenes region and they were literally begging Jesus to leave. He was not welcome there. But when he arrives back on this side of the lake, he is immediately met by Jairus, who is instead begging him to come. And so as I was thinking about this, I recognize that this is very telling. I think sometimes we experience that even now. It's very telling about what Jesus is able to do within situations. So in the Gerasenes region, Jesus was not welcome. So of course, when Jesus isn't welcome, we see not much happening there. But then by contrast, when we see this opportunity and some great miracles, a literal resurrection of the dead and this literal healing, it's not only was Jesus welcome, but they were literally begging him to come. I just want to sit with that for a second, because I think even now we have to realize that there are some places where Jesus is just not welcome. There are places where we don't see moves of the Spirit. There are places where we don't see miracles and signs and wonders because Jesus isn't welcome in those places. And so the result of that is naturally we're going to see those things happen in a place that is welcoming him. You know, this is a place where they were literally begging him to intervene and interact on their behalf. Whereas the opposition, when they're begging him to leave, it's just this natural thing that occurs that I think still occurs to this day. And so on the way to Jairus' house, we see Jairus is begging Jesus to come. His daughter is sick and he's on his way. And then we see this other healing happen. And again, like I said, we separated this for the kids show, but I think Mark really wants us to see these two happening at the same time, because this healing that's happening, remember what I said at the beginning of this section of this series of scenes that we're seeing, they both depict desperation. There's desperation in each of their stories. Each of these people, this woman and Jairus, are both desperate for a move of God in their lives. I wonder if you've ever been there. A woman who had been sick for 12 years with no cure. She had seen countless doctors. She had spent all her money. She was desperate. A man whose child was dying, that without intervention from Jesus, she was most likely going to die. You know, I don't know what your moment of desperation is. But friend, I want you to realize that you are not alone in that moment. It's in a moment of desperation that we can recognize that we have a God who enters in, who comes on the scene, who does not leave you alone. See, that woman, we don't know her name. We know that she was sick for 12 years. We know most likely it was uterine bleeding, which would have meant that she was also seen as unclean in that culture, meaning for 12 years she would not have been in relationship with other people in her community. And we see that woman try to sneak in and out without being noticed. You know, perhaps she didn't want to violate the Jewish law. She was unclean and she didn't want anybody that she touched to be unclean. She knew that that was the law. Or perhaps she didn't want to draw attention to herself because in that kind of situation, you know, it's embarrassing. Whatever her reasons were, she just tried to act in faith without anyone knowing. But then we see Jesus draw attention to her. And if you sit with that for a minute, we have to wonder why. Could he have let it go? Yes, absolutely. But instead, he faces her and he speaks to her. Why? Because the one who heals us knows us. And he wants us to know that we are known by him too. See, God not only sees you in your moment of desperation, he knows you. He knows you. And he wants you to know that you are known. And so what happens next? Well, Jesus makes sure that she acknowledges him publicly. And then the result of that, she's publicly restored. And I think that's such a beautiful picture of what restoration looks like. There's faith, a move of faith that takes an action, and then a healing, and then a realization that you are known, and then an acknowledgement of Jesus, and then a public restoration.
Greetings and God bless. This is Tyler Burns.
And this is Dr. Jamar Tisby.
And we want to invite you to check out our podcast, Pass the Mic, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church.
Pass the Mic has been speaking directly to the core concerns of Black Christians for over a decade.
On our show, we've got interviews from theologians, historians, actors, activists, and so much more.
Not to mention heartfelt, open dialogue on some of the heaviest issues facing the church in the United States.
Be sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you there on the next Pass the Mic.
My name's Preston Sprinkle, and I host the Theology in the Raw podcast. Theology in the Raw aims to help believers to think Christianly about theological and cultural issues by engaging in curious conversations with a diverse range of thoughtful people. I have conversations with a wide range of different guests who come from different perspectives, and no topic is off limits. Sexuality, abortion, politics, LGBTQ, warfare, violence, marijuana, immigration, you name it. If you have a theological or cultural issue that you have been wrestling with over 1,100 episodes, we've probably talked about it on Theology in the Raw. Along with conversations with various people, I also address questions sent in from my audience every month. And occasionally, I will talk about some of my latest research projects that I'm currently working on. Theology in the Raw is not for everyone. It is uncut, uncensored, and I don't give trigger warnings. So check out Theology in the Raw through your favorite podcast app.
Are you starting to see the process that happens? But we recognize that restoration, public restoration, only comes after the moment of desperation. And I wish that we could skip over some of that stuff. You might feel that way too. I think about moments in my own life where I was desperate for healing, desperate for the Lord to do a work in my life when other people didn't have the answers, desperate when something in my life felt like it was dying. But to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't know Jesus the way I know him now. And I wouldn't know how much I'm known by him if I didn't go through that process. And remember, all of this is happening while Jesus is on his way to the house of Jairus. Can you imagine what Jairus is thinking at this point? Because Jesus was delayed. Even if it was just a few moments, he was delayed by this woman. And so here, Jairus gets this news that his daughter has died. Can you imagine the emotions going through the heart and the mind of Jairus at that moment? Anger, sorrow, denial, grief, frustration. It can be really hard when you see someone else get a miracle while you're still waiting on yours. I've been there. I know it. And I know for many of you, you know it too. But what we learn here is that Jesus does not leave Jairus alone in the waiting. Instead, what does he do? He tells him, don't be afraid, just keep believing. And that's where we see a mark of extraordinary faith, because faith trusts when hope seems gone. Do you know why? Because hope is not a feeling, hope is a person. Faith says, I trust you. Jesus asked Jairus to trust him, and he does. And so what I know is this: there have been things in my life that I thought were dead that Jesus brought back to life in his timing. And so as Jairus held on to that word from Jesus, the people around him thought he was crazy. I've been there. I've been in a place where I've been holding on to this word from God, this promise from God, where he says, hold on, have faith, don't be afraid, just believe. And that dream seemed dead. And yet Jesus said to hold on, and people think you're crazy. But our faith has to speak louder than our fear. Faith in Jesus, the God who can calm the storm. Jesus is the God who can calm the storm. Jesus is the God who brings peace in the chaos. Jesus is the God who can heal when the doctors can't. Jesus is the God who can transform dead things into alive things. Now, I'm not ignorant to know that there is pain when we think about these kinds of things. And one of the things you might even be thinking is that there are still things in your life that feel like they have died. Maybe you're thinking specifically about someone that you love that has died or is in the process of dying. The reality is we live in a broken world. And I want to remind you that resurrection is not an event. Resurrection is a person. And Jesus has defeated death permanently. And so that may mean we don't see healing this side of heaven. That may mean that the healing is on the other side of heaven. But we have to remember that death has lost its sting. It is not permanent because of the resurrection, because of who Jesus is. So in these moments where you don't understand, when things feel hard and you're facing your moment of desperation, I want you to remember that you are not alone, that Jesus is the God who can resurrect all things. But we have to trust his timing, his will, his purpose, and that may look different than how we want it to look. But also this combination of desperation and faith are often the keys that open up the way for God to move in powerful ways in our lives. That does not mean that your faith has to be perfect. There may be obstacles along the way, but we have to recognize what we see in this passage when we look at the woman and we look at Jairus. There is an action piece in our faith. The woman had to actually reach out and touch the robe of Jesus. Jairus had to keep walking to his house when he thought his daughter was dead. There's an action part of our faith that recognizes that our desperation can only be resolved in Jesus. And so we need to allow our desperation to drive us towards him, not away from him. As we think about that, as we meditate on that, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread, and I want you to hold that in your heart as we think about this passage. Mark 5:21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed in around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and he asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the little girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you are the God of the resurrection, that resurrection is not an event, resurrection is a person. God, we thank you that we see this action part attached to faith that opens up power for healing, power for miracles, power for resurrection, for the things in our lives that we thought were dead. You can resurrect those things. God, I thank you that you are the Redeemer and the Restorer of all things. God, help us to understand that sometimes your timing looks different than our timing. God, we trust you. Help us to lean into this place of trusting you no matter what, when things look dead, when we are desperate. God, we thank you that you are the God that brings things back to life, that you don't leave us alone, that you walk alongside of us. Lord, I thank you for your presence in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Hey friends, are you loving the deep conversations, the biblical insight, and the spiritual growth content that I share on the Hearing Jesus podcast? Well, I've got some fantastic news for you. Starting at just $5 a month, you can become a member of our Patreon community and take your Hearing Jesus experience to a whole new level. When you join Patreon, you gain access to ad-free episodes, daily journaling prompts and worksheets, monthly bonus content, personalized Q&A sessions with me, giveaways, and more. As a Patreon supporter, you're not just a listener, you're a valued member of my inner circle. But that's not all. Our Patreon community is a place where you can connect with like-minded people who share your passion for spiritual growth, engage in meaningful discussions, share your thoughts, and be part of something that's truly special. Plus, we've got some awesome perks lined up for our Patreon supporters, from shout-outs on the podcast to exclusive merch and more. So if you're ready to dive deeper into the journey of hearing Jesus, head on over to patreon.com/Hearing Jesus. Your support makes a real difference, allowing us to continue bringing you inspiring content week after week. Also, a portion of any income from Patreon goes to support children through our partnership with Compassion International. Again, head to patreon.com/Hearing Jesus. Thank you for being a vital part of the Hearing Jesus community. Together, let's learn to live out our faith in our everyday life.
Hi, I'm Haven, and as long as I can remember, I have had different curiosities and thoughts and ideas that I like to explore, usually with a girlfriend over a matcha latte. But then when I had kids, I just didn't have the same time that I did before for the one-on-ones that I crave. So I started Haven, the podcast. It's a safe space for curiosity and conversation. And we talk about everything from relationships to parenting to friendships to even your view of yourself. And we don't have answers or solutions, but I think the power is actually in the questions. So I'd love for you to join me, Haven, the podcast.